Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program on Demand and Desire, Understanding Global Trade. I'm really excited to see so many people here tonight and to get to hear from such a distinguished panel. My name is Arthur Delong. I'm the chair of the fundraising committee of the World Affairs Council of Tacoma and an attorney over at Eisenhower Carlson, which is in part sponsoring tonight's event. On behalf of the council, we're pleased to partner with the University of Washington, Tacoma to bring you tonight's program and the ongoing Global Classroom series. Global Classroom is an interactive speaker series focusing on global issues with local significance, and for the last 2 years has been a regularly hosted collaborative series between the University of Washington, Tacoma's Institute for Global Engagement, the Division of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, and the World Affairs Council of Tacoma. The World Affairs Council of Tacoma has been active in the South Sound since the 1930s, with a mission to produce globally minded citizens through education and engagement. We're the only civic organization in the region whose work is devoted exclusively to programming around topical global issues, and the vast majority of our programs and events are completely open and free for the public to attend. Our website has a list of upcoming events. However, in order for these programs to be free, we rely on the support of our members, which allows us to engage more broadly in the community on a greater array of topics. To that end, if you're not already a member of the World Affairs Council of Tacoma, please go to our website and become a member. Also, if you'd like to be on our mailing list, or that of UWT's in regard to its global programs, please do sign up on the sign-up sheets over in the hall. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Divya McMillan, the Executive Director of both the Institute for Global Engagement and the Global Honors Program at UWT. She is an accomplished professor of global media studies and associate faculty of the South Asia Center. Dr. McMillan is actively engaged in community initiatives that bring education, business, and social services together. We are quite fortunate that she will be moderating tonight's panel. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. McMillan.
Thank you, Arthur. After that introduction, I feel like I've been around since the 1930s. We are so thrilled to have you all here, a beautiful crowd, gorgeous panel, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. We are also very proud to collaborate on Global Classroom, and this really delivers on the urban serving mission of our campus. And here to speak about that mission is our Chancellor, Mark Pagano. Chancellor Pagano is the 6th Chancellor of the University of Washington, Tacoma, and he is leading a strategic plan that places global learning as a very high priority. So it's my honor to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Professor McMillan. And she didn't tell you, and you haven't heard it, so let me tell you that Dr. McMillan is also our Distinguished Teacher of the Year for UW-Tacoma this year, too. So thank you. And I always appreciate her asking me to come welcome the audiences into these events. I look at that as my job, but it's also my privilege. And this morning, I've had a long day today. This morning, I was at an event right behind this wall. It was our Corporate Circle Awards. We give an award to one of our best corporate partners each year, and this is the 3rd annual year. So the room was full of people who really love Tacoma and love the University of Washington, Tacoma. And we had this young man who was our featured speaker this morning, and he was a student. He's actually in the room. I'm not going to point him out because I will embarrass him. But he gave a very impassionate speech about what this community means to him and what this school means to him. He talked about being a refugee from Iran 4 years ago, ended up in Tacoma, and then ended up at University of Washington, Tacoma, and now he can't look back. He looks at Tacoma as being his family, and he looks at the University of Washington, Tacoma, being his home. And then he described what a home meant to him. It's a place where you feel safe, where you feel secure, where you yearn to go. And it's a good thing I yearn to come here because I'm here all the time. But I felt like after hearing that this morning, it was my duty to welcome you into our home his home. We're so glad you're here tonight, and it's so appropriate that we have these global classrooms because you never know where in the world our students might end up. That's why we work so hard to give them the global perspective, because we want them to flourish and to feel comfortable and to be knowledgeable and to be productive no matter where they are. So welcome to our global classroom tonight. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic looking at the panel here. It's a distinguished panel, but I think somebody else gets to introduce them. So have a good evening.
Thank you, Chancellor Pagano. And now let's get right to the event, to our panelists. We have about an hour and a half, and we have so many issues to discuss. I want to say it's been such a pleasure planning this and working with the panelists behind the scenes. We've had some great conversations, and so we can't wait. So here I want to just set the global stage a little bit. In the middle of last month, if you were tracking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, President Trump attempted to reassure the world that his America First does not mean America alone. Yet, as the New York Times analysts wrote, all eyes were on China, not the United States, the leader of the newly formed Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP, a modification of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which had included the United States. Now, in academic environments, we love our acronyms, IGE, PPPA, but I think the trade world has got us beat there. So the waning integration impulse in developed economies really seems to be countered by an upsurge in the alliance impulse of developing ones. So one prime example, again, is China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this is really an ambitious route between China and Europe along the old Silk Route. And it signals the nation's intent to invest in the infrastructure of developing nations. So what does this mean for all of us? While lender countries on trade classify their interests as purely financial, we know them to be geopolitical. So that's just the global stage. And you might be wondering, now, where do I come into this picture? And how am I connected to trade? So we want to put at the forefront here the global framework, which focuses on interdependencies. We're all connected to it. We're all influenced by its ebbs and flows. And just about everybody in this room probably has done something with eBay or OfferUp or whatever, your garage sales. So we are all very, very connected to this exchange economy. So how do we understand the economic, political, legal, social, and cultural aspects of this complex process? So now I'm really honored and privileged to introduce our distinguished guests, and they will help us gain a clearer understanding of global trade in all its dimensions. And so here are a few words about the format of tonight's presentation. I will do a few words of introduction for each panelist, and then I've asked them to expand on their background and their experience, and then lay out for us a framework for tonight's discussion. So each will provide a few words on the challenges that they are experiencing in their line of work, and highlight for us the important issues we all need to consider. So we'll begin with Mark Chinen, Professor of Law at the Seattle University School of Law and Fellow of the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality. He was educated at Pomona College and Yale Divinity School before receiving his law degree from Harvard Law School. Before he began teaching law, Professor Chinen practiced in the areas of international trade, banking, and corporate and securities law in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Professor Chinen. Our second panelist, Dr. Emily Payne, is an associate professor of international political economy from the University of Puget Sound. Dr. Payne's research focuses on the role of multinational agribusiness in the global food regime and the effect this has on prices, populations, and economies. As a Fulbright scholar, she researched Chinese investment in the Brazilian soybean industry, and she was invited to a Washington, D.C. policy think tank workshop on the topic. She was interviewed on NPR's On Point about the global food aid crisis and by CNBC.com about antibiotic use in animals and food safety. And fun fact, Dr. Emily Payne takes her students down to Ruston Way to the big grain, what's it called, ship, elevator?
Yeah.
And that's their text. They study what's coming there and where it's going. I think that's really cool. Our third panelist, Mr. John Wolfe, is Chief Executive Officer of the Northwest Seaport Alliance. I mean, talk about a visionary organization that's about alliance. And in fact, trade economists and policymakers would talk about that as being the future of how we all work together as a global community. He sets the organization's vision and strategy and guides the alliance's unique customer-focused culture. Mr. Wolfe also serves as the CEO of the Port of Tacoma, a position he was named to in 2010, before which he served as the Port of Tacoma's Deputy Executive Director since 2005. And really, it's the port that keeps me here in Tacoma, because I think it's really amazing to look out your windows and watch these ships glide by, and then you're in another part of the world and you see the same names go by, and then you see these big containers, and you really get a sense of how interconnected this whole piece is. Prior to joining the port, Mr. Wolfe served for 2 years as the executive director of the Port of Olympia, and before that as Olympia's director of operations and marine terminal general manager. Welcome, Mr. Wolfe. And then our fourth panelist is Dr. B.J. Bullert, a documentary filmmaker and faculty at the Antioch University, Seattle. You all might recall, students, the big protests against Nike up in Seattle. And Dr. Bullert filmed it and made a film on it, and she has done a lot of activist films as well. She focuses on the arts of making media for social change. She is the author of Public Television, Politics, and the Battle Over Documentary Film by Rutgers University Press. She has served as a research fellow at the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. So massive biographies, and now we're going to have a massive discussion. You ready? All right, so I will turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves further and provide a bit of background on the issues we're going to talk about. We'll start with Professor Mark Chinen.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. McMillan, and thank you, everyone, for having me and all of us here this evening. I'm excited about what we'll be doing together, because my understanding is that although we will give some brief presentations and have some discussion, really the intent is for all of us here in this room to have a common conversation about these issues. So just a little bit more about myself. I've been teaching for 22 years now and work and do my scholarship in the area of international law. And I've been doing it so long, it's been in various areas of international economic law, such as finance, investment, and trade. The other thing, other interest I have, I guess, given my background, is that I do have this keen interest in the relationship between sometimes what is called the global north and south, and also the legacy of colonialism on current world affairs and in international economic law more specifically. And then also sometimes the relationship between theology and law as well, something that interests me. And then most recently, I'm working on a book now on the impact of artificial intelligence on concepts of legal responsibility. So that's the kinds of things I'm interested in. But for tonight, what I'd like us to, just to begin our conversation, is just to set a very, very broad framework for the kinds of things we'll be talking about tonight via 3 slides. So if we can see the first one here. This just gives us a very, very rough idea of the forms that international economic activity take in the world. And you can see that we tend to sort of divide it into 3 broad areas. The first is international trade, which is usually the trade of goods and services. And as you can see, that's a rough figure from the World Trade Organization that in 2016, there was about $15.46 trillion worth of goods, merchandise, that was exported in 2016. In finance, we see $4.3 trillion, and that's as it were, the cross-border transition of things like capital and finance or money. 4.3 trillion. That includes foreign direct investment. That was from 2015. And then there's something called foreign investment, which is the flow of capital in the form of stocks, bonds, or sometimes it is money from private investors into other countries. And you can see that amounts to about $1.8 trillion in 2015. Then labor. In 2015, the estimate is that there were about 140 million migrant workers that was crossing borders in order to engage in work in some kind. And so it's these 4 major activities that we think about. And so if we take a look at the next slide, I'm a lawyer, and so my concern tends to be about the law that purports to govern all of this activity. You can see that the law here is in quotations because when we talk about law and norms at this level, we're not really talking about all about hard law like treaties or laws and statutes, but we talk really about the series of norms, both formal and informal, that have an impact on these four activities that I just mentioned. And as you can see there, this is from a colleague, Lawrence Bull, who conceives of it as coming from these four major sources and all of them interacting with one another, and none more important than the other. So we have these influences. And the first is the market, private ordering, that we have private companies and engaged in activities. They, of course, encounter problems and have solutions that they resolve for themselves via contracts, et cetera. That becomes a way in which the norms of dealing with each other might emerge. As we go clockwise, we see international organizations like the United Nations, the ones that we would think about normally, that also have an important role in setting the norms of this activity. Then there is international law, the kind of law that we think of in the form of treaties, et cetera, that obviously will impact this. And then national law plays a very important role in the way in which, particularly globalization, its impacts are felt and then are sort of transmitted into every country. Now, I realize that's quite abstract, so just to the next slide, here's yet another broad, but hopefully a little bit more concrete illustration of how that works. So in the area of international trade, this provision of goods and services, we do have private actors like multinational corporations. Obviously here in Seattle and Tacoma, Boeing is an obvious one, Microsoft another. All of them engaged in their private activities and want the law, as it were, to be a certain way. We have trade groups that are keenly interested in this kind of work and lobby domestic and foreign organizations, et cetera, as law emerges. National law, we have U.S. trade laws and other law that has an impact on international trade. And then the famous international organizations we all have heard of, like the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. All of these are international organizations that promote or suggest or critique, et cetera, rules that are going to have this impact on international trade. And then finally, the international law that we normally think of. Here I refer to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, NAFTA, the TPP. There are 284 agreements like the TPP, et cetera, that exist right now, that all have this impact on the way countries and the way companies interact with each other. So I'll stop here and then let others have their turn, and then we'll continue this conversation.
All right, well, thank you for that. I'm actually going to pick up on a lot of what Mark has said. So again, my name's Emily, and I just wanted to first start by talking a little bit about where I come to this work from, and that is first as a farmer. When I was in graduate school, I was also farming about 600 acres of organic small grains. And we grew a lot of buckwheat because we had pretty crappy soil, and that grows well on crappy soil. And it just so happened that the largest organic buckwheat mill east of the Mississippi was about 50 miles from our farm. And so it was a great crop for us until all of a sudden one year we could not sell buckwheat for what it cost us to grow it. And it was because the mill was importing organic buckwheat from China cheaper than we could grow it on our farm. And this was the first kind of aha moment for me of, wait a minute, how is it possible that you could ship a low-value bulk commodity halfway around the world for less than I can grow it 50 miles away on my farm with no paid employees and rusted equipment and falling down outbuildings? And so I really wanted to try to understand the mechanics of international trade in food and how that kind of dynamic is possible. And this was also in the mid-2000s when Brazil sort of suddenly and out of nowhere started challenging the US for global market share in the soybean industry. And at that time, there was a lot of political rhetoric about fair competition between Brazilian and US farmers. And that reached a fever pitch in a way that made me I knew what the US farmers were saying about unfair competition from Brazil, And I became curious about how Brazilian farmers were seeing this issue. So obviously, agriculture is extremely nationalistic. Trade policies in agriculture tend to be much more protectionist than in other sectors for reasons of national security and food security. But at the same time that these sort of national constituencies of farmers are pitted against each other in organizations like the WTO, if you look at who is the biggest exporter of soybeans from China, or from Brazil, it's the same companies that are the biggest exporters of soybeans from the US. So even though the political rhetoric is that farmers are competing for competitiveness, the same 4 transnational corporations are really controlling that global market. So I started looking into the global soybean industry, and I came across this concept of private governance and governance by private regime. And this is an idea from Claire Cutler that really echoes a lot of what Mark just said, which means instead of just looking at the public sector to see how these economic issues are, how the rules are structured, we also have to look at the rules that are involved and the other sort of private actors that are participating in making those rules. So if you want to go to my first slide, this is a sort of another version of the slide you already put up there. But it just kind of is a way to try to show who these different actors are. So you obviously have transnational corporations in the soybean industry. There aren't very many of them. They are very large. There's actually about to be one fewer than what's on that list because there's talk of ADM and Bunge merging, which will be interesting. But you also have other private actors, many of the ones that Mark already mentioned, industry groups, lobbyists, et cetera. The public sector, obviously, international organizations, and here's where trade acronyms get really complicated. The WTO, the Federation of Oils, Seeds, and Fats, which is an international organization that arbitrates trade disputes between, in that particular sector. NGOs, grassroots movements, et cetera, et cetera. So my research really began with trying to understand how these governance structures are experienced on the ground in Brazil, right? Again, I knew what US farmers were saying. I knew what these dynamics were doing for farm economies in the United States. And I really wanted to try to understand how Brazilian farmers were seeing this issue, especially since, again, trade is so politicized at the national level, but largely managed by transnational corporations. Since I began my work, the landscape in the global food system has changed significantly, and my most recent research, as Divya mentioned, focuses on the rapid emergence of China as the world's largest soybean importer. Brazilian exports have grown dramatically over the last 15 years, and almost all of that increase in production has been absorbed by Chinese demand. So you can go to my next slide that just shows that sort of parallel trends. The blue line is Brazilian soybean production, and the red line is Chinese soybean imports. So China now consumes over 60% of all of the world's soybeans. You can go to the next slide. And this is a particularly interesting soybeans are a particularly interesting lens for understanding these dynamics because they're a singular crop in Chinese food policy for a lot of reasons that I don't really have time to go into here. But China is actually remarkably self-sufficient in food production, except in the soybean sector. And the reason that they're importing so many soybeans is largely for domestic pork production. You can actually go to the next slide that shows. So that just is it's showing imports of wheat, corn, and rice, which are the 3 lines at the bottom, compared to soybeans. Wow. So again, this is a really dramatic and interesting lens to try to understand how the entrance of China into the global agricultural market is shifting things on the ground for farmers, both in the US and in Brazil. There's no doubt that Brazil is going to be able to keep up with Chinese demand, at least in the short term, due to its incredibly sophisticated and highly industrialized method of farming. This is industrial farming on a scale that rivals what you see in the United States. You can go to the next slide. This is just a photograph that shows the line of combines in the front are harvesting soybeans, and the line of machines behind them are grain drills directly planting corn into the exact same field immediately after the harvest of the soybeans. Wow. So they can get at least 2, maybe 3 crops a year off the same piece of land, whereas obviously we have winter where that is not possible when all of our Midwestern grain fields are covered with snow half the year. And they sell the size of the machines that they sell them. They don't even sell the they sell combines and tractors that are much, much bigger in Brazil than they even sell in the United States. So the relationship between this massive soybean producer in Brazil, the massive soybean consumer in China, and the way that that sort of very quickly changing trade relationship is affecting farm economies in the U.S., farm economies in Brazil, that's really has been the subject of my most recent work. So we can talk, these kinds of issues will come up again, but I think that it's a really interesting moment to be talking about these processes, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panelists have to say. Thanks.
Okay, well, that was extremely interesting, and I have to admit, I am a bit intimidated sitting next to 3 doctors and maybe 4 here. I'm just a lowly CEO with an operational background. So I'm going to bring a different perspective, and that is more of a local perspective around trade. And so we are so fortunate here in Puget Sound to have these natural deepwater ports that are really magnets for global trade. And the best way I can describe that is right down here in the tide flats of Tacoma, there are multinational companies doing business right here in our backyard. So we truly are an international city surrounded by trade activity. And the primary reason for that is we are strategically located geographically in a great spot and with trade with Asia and primarily China, but certainly all of the Asian countries. And we have unique assets with deepwater ports and access via road and rail to inland markets. And so trade naturally flows through Puget Sound. Now, we shouldn't take that for granted, and we don't, because the competition is fierce. And our mission as ports is to create jobs and economic wealth for the communities we serve. And so really simply, it's about good-paying jobs right here in this community and the community up north in King County. So if we can go to the first slide. Recently, we've experienced a tremendous amount of change within the trade sector. A couple of high points. One is that we've seen larger vessels entering the trade lanes. And if you just were to watch the vessels that are coming in and out of the harbors of Seattle and Tacoma, you would notice that they are much larger than they were even 5 years ago. And that is a phenomenon that has upset the apple cart, so to speak, with the ports, because think of the ports as a system. And like any system, if you tax the system, any part of the system, too much, it chokes. And that's essentially what's happened with our port infrastructure. So by bringing in similar volume, but in a shorter time frame with larger vessels, it taxes the system. So we have to recreate that system. And so there's quite a bit of infrastructure investment. In fact, for those of you that live here in the community, if you pay attention to the, later this month, you'll see 4 of the largest cranes entering our port via China, and they will be coming in the end of this month. So pay attention to that. The reason for that is to serve these larger vessels that are calling the ports. The other change that is pretty significant in our industry is that the shipping lines post this Great Recession we experienced back in the late 2000s caused a huge disruption in trade and a huge disruption for the shipping lines. And so their pricing power was minimized, and so what they were forced to do was reduce cost to find profitability. And so what they did is operationally merged. Commercially, they still compete with each other, yet they form their own alliances, and they compete as alliances operationally. So they share vessel space, they share equipment to reduce their operating costs. Well, that was a game changer for the ports as well, because in the past, each of these shipping lines would have their own terminal, their own home, so to speak, where their vessel would call, and their competition had their own terminal as well. Today, we're seeing these alliances wanting to call the same terminal, so we're having to adjust the puzzle pieces on our board to make sure that ideally those alliances are calling the same terminal. So that was a huge disruptor for the industry. So how did we respond to that? Well, there are a number of ways. One of the more bold ways in which we responded was we formed the Northwest Seaport Alliance. And that's essentially a partnership, a joint venture partnership between the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, where we competed in the past. It didn't make a lot of sense for us to compete in today's environment because essentially all we were doing was taking business from each other and the jobs that come with that and shifting them from King County to Pierce County or Pierce County to King County. And it was dysfunctional because we were reducing our pricing power and minimizing the capital investments that we could make back into the facilities. So the commissioners that you all vote into office, they are elected, 5 in King County, 5 in Pierce County, decided to form this Northwest Seaport Alliance. And again, it's a 50-50 joint venture where we took our assets and our business and brought that together as one. And so we are working as a single unit, competing against other gateways like Southern California or Canada to the north of us, yet we're indifferent about whether the cargo calls Seattle or Tacoma. Really what we care about is growing the economic power throughout the region. So it's a pretty powerful joint venture agreement, one that actually caught the attention nationally and internationally. I've had folks visit even as far away as Hong Kong asking what we did and how we constructed this agreement. It is a very innovative approach to the changes in the ports and trade. Moving to the next slide. The port is what I would reference as the hub. We lean on many other supply chain stakeholders for trade, and many of them are highlighted here. I won't read all of them, but it takes the whole system working together for trade to occur, because it is not just the movement of those goods through the port, it's through the whole supply chain. From the time that a product is manufactured, whether it's in Brazil, as we heard from Eileen, or mainland China, or even the U.S., to those foreign markets that it's trying to reach. And so these are the stakeholders that we work closely with to make sure that there's efficient movement of cargo and trade, so that we can remain competitive and keep the jobs, the healthy jobs that are here in our community. And then the last slide that I have before we move on is just another illustration of the movement of cargo. And again, I won't go through all the details, but needless to say, what looks like a pretty simple operation is highly complex, and there are many factors that influence trade, not just the price of goods, but how the goods are moved, what are the different modes of transportation, and all of the decision-making processes within that the owners of those goods look at when they're making a decision about whether to use a Seattle-Tacoma gateway for the movement of their goods to the markets they're serving, or another gateway. And so we have to consider all of these factors as we try to compete for additional cargo opportunities and the jobs that come with it. So I'll stop there. Again, a little bit more of a local perspective around trade that complements the other speakers.
Well, thank you for that. That's a really good setup for what I find really intriguing about this whole debate or whole question of globalization. And that has to do with putting a human face on the people who are actually manufacturing the goods that end up being shipped in the large containers that come to Seattle and Tacoma for distribution elsewhere in the country. My work has to do with the, well, actually, I've got to come out of the closet here. I'm an academic, so I teach at Antioch University. I make documentary films that are all about telling stories. And I also am doing research, sort of looking back at the strategic role of kind of activist public relations folks as they try to gain recognition for some of the economic injustices or the economic realities facing workers in the factories where they may be manufacturing shoes or apparel or cell phones. Actually that's more than two, that's three things: research, interest, teaching, and filmmaking. But for me, I'd like to start with that first slide. I selected this because I believe that might be an Ivanka dress, but it is an example of a very useful rhetorical strategy that's been used by labor activists, particularly those who align themselves with human rights organizations, who have been trying to put a human face on the supply chain. So here we have a worker in a factory, I believe that's in Vietnam, who made the beautiful yellow dress she's wearing for 60 cents. In the United States, it would be bought for $50. Now, that is actually a pretty consistent, there are places where the ratio of the labor wages that go into the manufacture are like 1 to 70, depending on whether you're talking about Air Jordans or if you're talking about other kinds of high-priced items. And so my research work has to do with how the message is being communicated to end users, that is, the consumers who end up purchasing items at H&M or at REI or at any of the TJ Maxx or any of the other places. I, again, wanted to share this with you because this is an example of just one of those campaigns. There are also campaigns that have to do with workers from factories where the goods are manufactured actually coming to the United States and having sticker shock when they see the items that they had made selling for huge amounts of money. Tactically, this was a very useful approach for raising awareness about the conscious consumer. And of course, it was made possible because of the internet and because of the communications interconnectivity that really became a useful research tool starting pretty much in the 1990s as more and more manufacturing was done in these factories abroad. So I want to just mention this because probably I fess up. Some of the clothes I'm wearing, I'm sure, were made in these places, and I paid the $50 for the good. You can't really get away from it, it seems, which is why I wanted to show you the next slide. My original work on the anti-sweat movement was done in 1999, and that was at a time, you'll probably remember the WTO protests, but that was at a time when there was more and more work being developed by sort of progressive media scholars to kind of unmask the economics of one's life. And in that context, there were organizations that started being founded that specifically sought to connect consumers with producers. So one of those organizations was United Students Against Sweatshops. This organization now has grown, and it's been nearly 20 years now, has over chapters in over 200 Canadian and American college campuses, and have exerted a tremendous amount of influence in terms of shaping some of the decisions made by different universities about where the apparel goods bought in the bookstores originate from. The University of Washington just recently was successful in forcing the University of Washington administration to open some Nike factories to the Workers' Rights Consortium, which is a nonprofit independent organization that goes in to check on labor conditions and labor standards, particularly when they hear of conditions like workers standing for 10 hours a day, not allowed to be taking bathroom breaks, or situations where, as recently as in Vietnam, where the temperature was over 90 degrees and people were passing out and fainting. So the students from a relatively small group of university students who were conscious of the supply chain and where their things were coming from, they worked together. They reached out and connected with labor organizations, developed procedures for observing what was going on in the factories. They started deconstructing the clothes that they were buying at the Gap and elsewhere. And in the course of doing that, they helped raise awareness not just among themselves, but among others in the broader community through press coverage. So I mentioned, I know we have how many students do we have in the crowd here? Okay, well, have any of you heard of United Students Against Sweatshops? Good, wonderful. You can find out more just by Googling them. As I was saying, the supply chain was very much a part of the strategy for putting a human face on the clothes we wear. But there is another very, very important aspect to it, and that's in the next slide. This isn't a direct one, but this is, you see all the cameras and the microphones and things like that? If a story doesn't have documentation, it doesn't have legs. And this is just a still from a current project I'm working on, a current film project I'm working on, which has to do with Cook aquaculture. Now, John, you might, I don't know if you noticed that guy there, the fisherman. That's Pete Knutson, who was also one who led a pretty substantial effort to keep Fishermen's Terminal for working fishermen, and succeeded. So again, I just show that to you as an example of the importance of media as witness. In the case of the sweatshops, the New York Times and different organizations, different media organizations picked up the stories as soon as they realized it was a story. That's a much broader conversation, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was an amazing introduction, and I guess you didn't hear anything that I said. That was an amazing introduction. Thank you, everybody. And as we were preparing for this panel, we were struck by how many themes were emerging. So it's my job to be the moderator and also the timekeeper, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. So we'll do some quick questions here, and we have picked 3 broad themes. And thank you, BJ, for ending on that note of how does an issue become an issue, because my first question today to our panelists is really about this big decision-making process, and each one is encountering the complexities of decision-making from where they sit. So the first question is, if we think about trade as an inherent feature of globalization, as a multidimensional process, it obviously involves very complex decision-making. So if you can comment on what decisions or decision-making processes you are accountable to, how does this complicate your work? And then to move to the consumer activist side of things, what is the process by which an issue becomes an issue, and what challenges does this pose to your work, those who are in the industry? So perhaps, John, would you like to take that question or start with it?
Sure, happy to. Thank you. Wow. There are 2 examples that I can lean on in the recent last year and then last couple of years. I'll go back a few years, last couple of years first. I recall the Port of Tacoma, this prior to the formation of the Seaport Alliance, and I'm sure Seattle experienced similar things. It felt to me like the Port of Tacoma had a license to operate and to pretty much do what we wanted to do. We had the trust of the community, and it felt like the community didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to the port, maybe was appreciative of the port, yet didn't pay a lot of attention. And for those of you that have been here a few years, you might have heard or read about when the port leaned into the opportunity with the methanol plant. And that was a learning experience for me because it was the first time that I realized in a very different manner that the community has a voice, a very strong voice, and that this truly is the community's port. And we're stewards of that port, and we're responsible to the community we serve. And so it was interesting because, not to go too far into that specific situation because we could be here all night on that, yet it goes back to the question that Divya posed about decision-making and how did we come to that decision. And you know, anytime one goes through challenging times, oftentimes you have self-reflection afterward and think, wow, how did I get to this point and what could I have done differently not to feel this pain? And I recall when I received the call from the governor's office and the governor's office was so excited about this opportunity because it was taking, from their perspective and certainly ours as we learned about it, a cleaner fuel source, gas, converting it to a liquid form, exporting it to China where they were burning coal to use as a fuel source for manufacturing. So globally, we were so excited because we thought, wow, we've got this great economic opportunity that's going to create jobs and economic wealth, and we're going to bring huge capital investment into our community in the billions of dollars, and we're going to have a strong environmental story globally. How is this a loser? And then to fast forward, find out that the community didn't want this. And so those decision-making processes are highly complex. They really are. And there are local issues that one needs to consider separate from national or even international issues. Mm-hmm. And all of those perspectives are critically important in thinking through decision-making, and this was a good example of that. I will go to one other example real quick, and that is a more recent example. Again, you may have read about it. Back in 2008, the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Vancouver, BC partnered on a clean air strategy, and within that, we have a clean truck program. And the notion of it was to, by January 1st of 2018, to have 2007 or newer truck engines using our gateway. And the reason for that is they emit less diesel particulate matter. So it's a good thing for the environment. Well, back in 2008 or 9, we thought, boy, we'll get there by 2018. That's a long way off. Here we are on the doorstep of it, and we're about 50% compliant. And what I found fascinating about this, even today, is that in my world, in typical form around a difficult issue, usually, and not always, but usually you have the business side and maybe even labor side on one side of an issue, and you have an environmental group and maybe even a social perspective on the other side of a difficult issue. And what I found fascinating about this one was that the social aspects of this issue were pitted against the environmental aspects. And the reason for that was that the folks, the drivers that weren't compliant with this requirement, a goal or requirement, couldn't afford it. And many of them, most of them, are immigrants that have come to the United States to pursue the dream of America with good intentions, and we had this heavy burden placed on them to buy a newer truck, and they're asking, well, gosh, my 2003 truck works just fine. In fact, it works better than the 2007. You're going to put me out of business, and by the way, I have a family. I'm raising a family, offset by an environmental perspective that said these trucks are causing cancer in those that are breathing it in the local community, and we need to clean the air. And so you step back and you look at that, and you look at one perspective and you say, absolutely, I'm sympathetic to that issue. And absolutely, we want a cleaner environment. We want to operate in an environmentally friendly way. I illustrate these because what might seem like a simple issue is highly complex, and the decision-making process of that is highly complex.
Please go ahead, other panelists. Same question.
The work I do is not, well, because I'm a academic, I don't make those kinds of decisions as John and his organization does. But I think where it shows it for me is that, often I am interested in things at the international level where I suggest or critique something that is happening at the international level. And I have to be honest that, I don't really know if it were to be implemented, a suggestion I made, what impact it will have. And you'd like to think that it will be an improvement, but given the complexity of these kinds of issues, it's unclear. So one small example, well, it's not a small example, but some people here might know that one of the concerns people have about free trade agreements is the way they have, that each one tends to have a dispute resolution mechanism. And many of them enable private companies, multinationals, to sue other countries if there's some aspect of the policy that they believe is in violation of one of these agreements. And often that leads to, at least in some instances, almost draconian monetary awards in favor of these companies. And so I've written a few things sort of exploring those impacts and what that might mean, and then have made a few suggestions about what could be done to lessen that award. And the thing about that is, I think that I'm making the right suggestion, but at the same time, I also know that it probably has some unintended consequences of maybe it could, if adopted, then it might prevent some companies from deciding to invest abroad. And if that happens, what impacts is that going to have on potential for employment in that country, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is, as John's mentioned, kind of an exercise in humility that you really do not know what the answers are going to be all the time. It's a constant sort of appraisal of what these impacts might be.
Well, I'll just pick up on that and briefly say, in my work, one of the things that that has been really interesting, again, is going back to this idea of private governance. And we think of trade agreements and trade policy as being sort of exclusively in the realm of politics and government. And we don't necessarily really think about the way that the private sector interacts with that. And I think that, particularly in the realm of trade agreements, it becomes really important because not just, we think about, okay, how does the private sector influence the political process? We think of lobbying. We think of, U.S. companies using their influence to convince political parties or individual lawmakers to do a particular thing, but that also happens transnationally as well. And one of the examples that I found in my work was the first time I was in Brazil, and Brazil was negotiating a complaint in the WTO against U.S. cotton subsidies, which is, again, something I could talk about all day, but I will not. One of the really interesting things I found was that the only non-governmental body that sort of sat at the table with the Brazilian trade negotiator and had direct access to, advising the Brazilian trade negotiator was a research institute that was called, I wrote it down because I always forget, the Brazilian Institute for International Trade Negotiations, that was largely funded by American agribusiness companies or US-based agribusiness companies. And so it's, I think that when we're thinking about decision making, it's helpful to have these concepts that help us understand how the private and the public sector interact in those spaces.
And I'd like to pick up on that theme, but I'm thinking about it through the prism of the press, about how does an issue become an issue. It's very easy to think, there's the press is an imperfect filter of information, and most stories don't even make it through the gauntlet. But in my area of research, I look at how an issue becomes an issue by virtue of who's reporting on it and how they're framing the issue. So when you're probably familiar with the saying of if it bleeds, it leads. Well, that's certainly true when it comes to major disasters in the global supply chain, such as when over 1,000 workers died in the Rana Plaza fire in Bangladesh in 2013. When there's a major crisis where there are witnesses to report on it, then a story ends up being considered newsworthy, and therefore it's covered in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. There's also a new ecosystem, media ecosystem that we live in, where social media and Facebook and alternative channels of information can seed larger stories to reach out. This is part of the general idea that policy isn't made just by policy people or even by just interest groups. It's made when the press weighs in on a particular issue and it becomes a public discussion factor that can then be used politically. So that's where I'm coming from.
Terrific. This is prompting me to think about some of my own research in sweatshops and call centers in India, and the issues that you're talking about. I mean, where does decision making actually happen, and then how effective is it, and who are all the complex players? And when you're planning for something, it can completely take a left turn because you cannot anticipate or predict how people live their lives and what actually has so much importance to their daily routines. Paul, if you could move to that. So I'm just throwing up a quick slide from my own work here. The first one shows a factory in India where these women are making zippers for ski outfits. And then the second one is on the studio, on the sets of the Indian version of the Newlywed Game. And so kind of like BJ is talking about, my interest in my research is to draw these connections or understand the correspondence between the workers, their desires, and the modernizing narratives that are on hybrid television. And just by the way, that's the Titanic in the background, and we know the end of that story. So that's, Newlywed Game, romance, whatever. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. So anyway, when we're looking at decision-making processes, sometimes we also see the privilege of activism and protest in an environment where people have access to these avenues, where they have forums like these to discuss these issues, and then to actually make a difference, or speak to a CEO who is listening to their issues. So perhaps, panelists, if you could talk to us a little bit about the cultural and social implications of trade. Could you describe aspects of your work that help us understand how this is experienced more generally, how this is experienced on the ground, and then perhaps those who are in the industry and policy and legal realm can talk about what is missing in this macro narrative of international trade, finance, investment policies. How do we bring these issues to the fore? So I threw out 5,000 questions in one, but generally, if you could speak to the social, cultural implications of trade, and then what is missing in our international policies that do not address these hidden features.
There's one thing that I'd just like to mention. In preparation for today's talk, I went back and I interviewed some of the people that I interviewed 20 years ago. And one of them was a guy named Jeff Ballinger, who initiated the campaign against Nike way back in the 1990s. And he said that when you look at globalization, when you look at supply chain, he was arguing that the paradigm really hasn't changed at all, and that outsourcing is the problem. That when you have companies who own and operate the factories where their goods are produced, it creates a different set of accountability issues. And he pointed out something called, Zara, the clothing company, apparently it's the biggest one in Europe and most successful one. And I hadn't known this before, but it was sort of assumed that outsourcing was the way things had to be, particularly in things like apparel. But apparently Zara has a system where they have very quick turnaround. They own the factories. The workers 60% of the workers are paid European wages in northern Portugal and Spain, and they have a rapid response in terms of changes in fashion. And so I'm thinking there may be an alternative approach, at least in this micro world of apparel, as a different economic model, not the one that was taken to be inevitable, with outsourcing and maquiladoras, et cetera.
Well, I'll speak to the question of the sort of social and cultural implications of these issues. And, my work really focuses on like big commodity farmers, people driving huge John Deere tractors, they're highly capitalized. And so they may seem to be, and they are not, objectively, they're not vulnerable in the same way that sweatshop workers and call center workers are vulnerable. But what's really interesting is in these little tiny towns sort of on the frontier of agriculture in Brazil where, the soybean fields runs right up against the edge of the rainforest, even the girl who works in the hair salon knows the spot price for soybeans on the Chicago Board of Trade every single day, right? These towns are completely and totally dependent on the single commodity for their existence and for their survival. And so even the most subtle shift in policy or attitude in that particular market can send tremors through these communities. And so, if China rejects a shipment of Brazilian soy claiming that it has been contaminated with fungicide, or if they default on a contract for any reason, it causes a great deal of anxiety, partly because, yes, these farmers are very highly capitalized, but they're also extremely indebted. They are completely and totally tied into commercial relationships with these transnational soybean traders that they don't really have a way out of. There really isn't any competition in these markets. And so while on the one hand, objectively, again, they're doing pretty well compared to a lot of folks in Brazil, they're also still in a very marginal place. And I think it's really important to remember that because, they are nervous about being so dependent on a single buyer for their product, as are farmers in the United States. Particularly one that they see as unpredictable. And I think this is one thing that's really interesting about the entrance of China into this market is these farmers, they don't even see Cargill and ADM as foreign companies anymore. They are, the people who work for Cargill in these towns are Brazilian and their kids go to school together and they play soccer together. They don't see them as a foreign company the way that they see these Chinese delegations that are representing these state-owned industries like COFCO, which is the big Chinese state-owned agribusiness. And they're skeptical of, they see Cargill as being sort of apolitical. Cargill likes to present itself as being apolitical as well, saying, look, we're going to buy soybeans wherever they're cheapest, and we're going to sell them to whoever will pay the highest price, right? And the farmers who on the ground have the sense that these Chinese agribusinesses have some other kind of motive, right? That it's political, it's about food security for the Chinese people rather than just kind of naked market rationality, which makes them nervous. And whatever, rightly or wrongly, I think that makes a difference in the dynamic that is happening in these communities as China becomes the biggest buyer of soybeans in the world. And again, I think it's important to remember that these big farmers are still vulnerable in this system. And this is true in the U.S. as well. The suicide rate among farmers in the U.S. is higher than that of veterans, and it's higher than any other profession in the United States. And it can be hard to imagine, when you see somebody with millions and millions of dollars of equipment and land, that they're suffering that much, but they operate on such razor-thin margins that a single bad crop year can lead to bankruptcy. And there's so much that's out of their control: weather, pests, diseases, and production costs are so high that the last thing they need is increasing market volatility, brought on at least in part by the looming specter of a trade war. And that's what is being, now that and this is, I know, one of the other questions that we were going to address, but what are the implications of the political implications of Trump's sort of pulling back from these free trade policies? And I think for farmers, it's really, it provokes a lot of anxiety because on the one hand, agriculture is dependent on these very protectionist policies, subsidies and import quotas and all that kind of stuff, but it's also dependent on free trade, right? The American economic sector that would probably be hurt among the worst, if not the worst, by pulling back from free trade agreements is agriculture. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I do think that, when we think about what these what the sort of vagaries of the political moment mean to farmers on the ground. It is that they're already in a really marginal position, partly because of their relationship with transnational capital, and it only makes it even more destabilizing for them.
Actually, why don't we take that and move that into the next part of the discussion? We have about 5 minutes before we open it up to the audience for questions. And so this specific point about Trump's pullback from trade, pulling out of the TPP, it could be seen as a response to the surge in populist nationalist sentiment. So our students here, I mean, in the Global Honors Program, we have a globally focused curriculum, but these are students who are coming back because jobs have been outsourced probably. That's one of the reasons I wrote my first book, because I had so many students who were in the classroom because their jobs had been outsourced. So if you could speak to this, the political implications then of the United States pulling back from various trade treaties, and Trump has said he will not sign regional or multi-party agreements because it ties U.S. hands, and of course we're seeing the surge in nationalism and populism. If you could comment to that. Mark, would you like to take that?
I'm happy to do that. So I just read a report by Danny Roderick, who writes on globalization and the economy, and I agree with what he's arguing. And he says this, is that populism obviously has many sources, and globalization is one of them. And part of the role that globalization has played is twofold. One is that we have to admit that globalization has led to many benefits for people, but other people have been seriously hurt by that. He points to studies of the impact of NAFTA and also the entrance of China to the World Trade Organization, both of which resulted in an influx of products here to the United States, where it was clear that people lost jobs as a result of it, and wages actually lowered. And so, Emily, your illustration of what happened with that crop I'm sorry, I'm not a farmer, so I don't recall the crop, is so compelling because that happened, that was replicated thousands and thousands of times. And the developed world has not done a good job of being able to compensate people who have been displaced by that, by those kinds of influx of goods. But the thing about it is that, so it's natural then to think that, yes, those kinds of things have happened as a result of globalization. But we should all acknowledge, though, that the kinds of stresses that we're describing here, it's not just because of globalization, it's because of automation, it's because of the rise of sophisticated technologies that are robotization, that just really have an impact on these kinds of jobs. The only thing I'll say, because I know other colleagues would want to chime in, is that Roderick makes this really interesting point, is that globalization shows up in many different ways. So when it shows up in influxes of as it were, forced migration, say, as experienced in Europe with, say, Syria, those kinds of things. It shows up, populism shows up in forms that take on a very much kind of a racist, race-based kind of nationalism. He also argues, though, that when the impacts are felt more in terms of things like lost jobs, these kinds of impacts, it will then show up in a kind of a left-based populism. So we'll see a Bernie Sanders-like kind of movement which tries to, as it were, address right, so something like that. He says, though, that the United States is a kind of a mixture where we've seen globalization impact us both in terms of, say, lost jobs and other kinds of impacts. But of course, given our history and also because of the important role that migration has played in our culture, it shows up in that way too. And so we're seeing a sort of a blend of populism, and globalization is playing that part.
Thank you. Shall we open it up to the audience for questions? I'm sure you'll have, I'm just delighted to see students from all across campus. Thank you for coming for this late evening event, and we have so many community members here as well. So please, here's what we'll do. Paul and I think Mark in the back will have microphone, just Paul. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand and he will bring the mic to you. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Timothy Abramov, and as much as I enjoy trade and kind of macro scale, I'm interested kind of in the local aspect of the Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, and I was reading some of the cargo stats that were posted by the Northwest Sea Alliance, and they've been, as I understood it, they were kind of going down on so the domestic volumes decreased, but the international increased by 4%. So I was wondering, definitely the kind of the trade deficit, we can see it happening to an extent, as I understand it. How do we, from a local perspective, try to mitigate that and get more export done?
Sure. I'll try and tackle that question, and certainly others may help. We have an abundance of export opportunities in the state of Washington, much of which resides on the other side of the state. So when we talk about trade policy, I'm certainly not an expert. I think some of the other colleagues here have a better perspective on that. Yet, I find a curiosity around protectionism, because what it feels to me like there is a reaction to that globally. And so I'm curious as to whether maybe focusing on incentives rather than trying to protect, throw up protectionism as a basis for protecting our trade opportunities might be a better option. With regard to the export markets, it comes down to one, we've got to keep our ports as viable gateways for trade. And so when at a local level, when a farmer is moving their goods to the port and they run into congestion problems because our infrastructure is inadequate, that has an effect on their competitiveness because it adds cost to their product, and we're competing in a global economy. So if the buyer can find the same product or similar product at a lesser value, they're gonna move in that direction. So there's a responsibility that we as a port authority have to make sure that we have a highly functional port gateway and the infrastructure is adequate. I would say that two, we need to make sure that we have trade policy that is friendly towards those export market opportunities. And so again, I think there are, I know there are resources there that the farmers lean on at the state and federal level to help in that area. And then I would say that there's a labor component to this that is really important too, whether it's the trucking community or our labor partners that are on the docks, making sure that there's a cooperative effort there so that they aren't an impediment to trade. And we've seen that, we've experienced that, and it's not just labor, it's a relationship between labor and the employers and that whole dynamic. And when that starts to break down, and we experienced it a few years ago, we had slowdowns on the waterfront, and the impact to the exporters was tremendous because what happened, using one example, the hay growers that were exporting to both Japan, Korea, and China were not able to get their hay to market. And so those users of the hay, the buyers of the hay, found other markets, and there was a stickiness to that other market. So even after we got back to a functional port gateway, they lost market share, significant market share, and the price point by which they could sell their goods to that market was reduced. So it had a huge impact and a lasting impact. So those are the many dynamics that I see for our export markets. Yeah.
Thank you. I have one question. My question is, based on everything you explained, some, I call it the giant corporation, they get the strength in this global economy. And that cause the inequality in entire world and force all the small business to go out of the this game. So how we can address this issue and make a more fair playground for every player and provide a better equality in the society?
Small question. Let's solve it right now. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the work that I've done in Brazil is the way in which the communities where I do my research were really created by these transnational corporations. There never was a small business to be driven out of the market in the first place in some of these areas. And I think that the global food system is one in which those processes are going to be really hard to sort of undo. And I think that there is sort of a knee-jerk reaction to kind of retreat into like locavorism and eating local food and all of that, which is great and wonderful and important and all of those things. But I think that it can sort of, this is not a problem that we can shop our way out of. It's not a matter of buying the right kind of food or the right kind of sweater. I think it really is an issue of becoming more politically literate and really paying attention to how your legislators and representatives are voting on some of these unsexy political issues like the Farm Bill, like, at the local level, how we're controlling access to farmland and how the distribution of land and all of those kinds of issues. And so I really think that it's important to think about it at the political level, particularly when you have an issue that seems so big and so impenetrable. And there's no socially conscious brand of soybean, or there's no socially conscious cornflakes that you can buy. Like this is a global food system that doesn't necessarily have an easy sort of consumer entry point. And so I think that it's really important to think about it at the political level.
Mm-hmm. I would say that in a slightly different context, in the apparel world, there's a small business in a place called Villa Alta Gracia, which manufactures clothing. It has the workers there are paid like $3 an hour, which is sustainable and great. It's had a ripple effect on their being able to send their kids to college and have adequate housing, and it's a really pretty extraordinary thing. To me, what was most surprising is they just signed a contract with the Dallas Cowboys. So that they work on the full supply chain, not just the manufacturing of the good, but they have a designated market that they've been able to cultivate, partly through the social connections and the social justice community that they're a part of. So it's only a company of maybe 800 workers, but it's one of those small, tiny little flickers of light. But it's not the macro view, it's the micro view.
I might make two comments in response to your question. One is, I think it's fair to say that there's been, and it continues, this enormous concentration of industries like food, any kind of manufacturing. And of course, the answer to that used to be very strong anti-competition and antitrust law, and that has weakened substantially over the past couple of decades, and for any number of reasons. But my hope, at least, is one possible way is to have see a strengthening in that, because it will take something as powerful as a government to be able to break up some of or to counter the dynamic that you're describing, or that we study. And the other thing I would say, I don't know if it's quite on point, is that when and I'm here and speaking this to all of us, when we hear about all these kinds of things, it sounds like we're just, I don't know how to put it. These are massive developments over which you have very little influence or control. Even the massive farmer in Brazil feels vulnerable, et cetera. So it seems to me, though, that you can take two things. One could be simply washing our hands of it, and it's the ostrich in the sand kind of method. But I think the other thing, though, is it gives me at least hope that we all can get involved in it, because if it's true that the conglomerate is feeling as vulnerable as we might be, then I think we have a common ground to start working together. And if it's also true that nobody really has the right answer, or at least over the long term, then it gives us more confidence maybe we can contribute to the answers, right? So I think those are how to respond to your question.
It was a good question.
Yeah. We have time for a couple more, Patrick, and then you.
So I'll go quickly. First of all, I thank you very much for all of your presentations and answers. It's very inspiring and make me think of more questions as well. Mine is to do as average citizen or student or faculty or whatever here. How should we view this? And the two main line of question that I have is, one is subsidies. You know, we've heard about a lot of government subsidies and this and that. You know, Boeing and Airbus said that, but the farmer also said that in different countries, actually. How should we view it? And in Mark's point, you just said, yeah, well, we have some role to play. What role can we play? And the other big line of things, you know, for maybe Mr. Wolfe or others, is carbon footprint of all these trades. But there's too many things that I cannot ask so many questions at once anyway, but please give you any comment. Just for us, for me as a citizen, or heard about all this. So is it like Trump said, these are fake news, or is it real, or what are they?
Right.
Who would like to take that? What do you do? Actually, that was a question that we had on the in my roster here. What can one do? And it's a massive question. Do you want to do a rapid fire? John, how do we save the world?
Start local, I don't know. You know, with the second part of your question, the carbon footprint, certainly I know that the port is taking a significant role in that, mostly at a local level, because that's where we have our sphere of control. We have influence as we step out of that at a state and national level. And so we have certain metrics that we measure against, benchmark and measure against, to make sure that as we grow, we do that in an environmentally friendly way. The best way that we achieve that, though, is through the partnerships with our customers. And more often than not, the customers want to do the right thing, and they don't want to be regulated. They would rather partner and cooperate that way. And so regulation, in my experience, comes in when we aren't responsive enough. And so the motivation is to stay ahead of the game. And so we build into our agreements with our customers a mutual accountability to do things in the right manner so that we can continue to operate and have that license to operate and have the trust of the community we serve. That's how we approach the carbon footprint issue.
Could I ask a follow-on question? What is an example of how the partnership has worked as opposed to the deregulation, or as opposed to regulation?
With the customer base?
Yes.
Give an example of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So was meeting with one of our key importers, a company that you all probably buy from. And we were negotiating an agreement, and they presented, before we could really get into our regulation through our contract, they presented their platform by which they operate. And it was far more robust than what we presented. And so they brought that in and said, we would like to offer this solution to how we're going to operate within your gateway. And so that was a great example. I could get into details, but rather than having, say, a state of Washington come in and say, you're going to build under these conditions, you're going to build a green standard building, or you're going to reduce your carbon footprint by X. If we stay ahead of the game by going above and beyond because it's the right thing to do, then I would argue the state doesn't need to offer regulation. In fact, we need to tell our good stories and help the political and leadership of the state understand that we are doing the right thing. So it's that mutual accountability.
Let's take the final question, and all speakers have signed a contract to stay here until midnight. So right after this, if you have more questions, please do come up. But let's take that question, because I know you would want to respond to the last few questions all at the same time as well. Please.
Hi, I worked for Starbucks for about a decade, And there was a lot of positive discourse about the impact of fair trade buying practices by Starbucks, and a lot of Kool-Aid drinking went into that. And so I thought I was ethically consuming such a global commodity when I was working there. But I'm wondering, I've watched a couple documentaries since then that have kind of stymied my go fair trade practices. What are the actual positive impacts that fair trade practices, and how stringent are the standards where they actually produce ethical buying choices for farmers on the ground in places like Ethiopia?
That's a really good question. I'm going to have to pass it over to the food person here.
Well, I mean, I think, and it's going to be hard for me to not give a really long answer to this question, but I think on the one hand, it depends. It depends on, because fair trade is not something that's regulated like organic is regulated. It's not, it's generally regulated by private or nonprofit organizations. And that gets me, I'm very tempted to get on my soapbox about private standards and how private standards that are negotiated between suppliers and producers have a the role of those standards is really growing, particularly in food retailing. And the implications of that for trade and for producers are very mixed. And that goes for fair trade. It also goes for, things that are certified sustainable palm oil and timber and soybeans. And all of these this vast proliferation of private standards is really, in my mind, kind of problematic. And I think that the answer to the fair trade question, again, it really depends, and I don't think that you can necessarily, you can't really come to a blanket conclusion, and it may not be a very satisfying answer. But there are some fair trade certifying organizations that have a much better reputation than others, and I think that, I guess the message I would want to leave you with is that it's not a fail-safe. And again, this sort of gets back to my argument about ethical consumerism, is that you can't necessarily, seeing that label and saying, okay, I can feel good about buying this product and I don't have to look further than just that label, is really, I think, undermining any gains that have been made by the organizations that are really, doing a lot of hard work on the ground. Those labels are really easily co-opted.
Thank you. And instead of my 2 minutes to summarize, I actually do want to turn it over to the panelists. What would you like to leave them with, as you started with Emily? So BJ, Mark, John, if you could, what message would you like to leave the audience with?
Well, the only message I'd really like to leave with you all is to be very aware of the decisions you're making and where your goods come from. I would like to, ideally, it's so easy to fall into the seduction of hope, the idea that we can just hope that a better world will happen if we just hope. But things like that don't happen without action. And so I think that I have some inspiration in the possibility of people being just simply more conscious of the decisions they're making, and using evidence and not fake news. Just little media literacy will help.
I think I just would echo that. Is I think what I would recommend for all, or urge us all to do, is for all of us to stay informed and be informed.
I would challenge myself and all of you that when you look at an issue and you have an opinion, and then you hear an opinion that is different than yours, to seek that out with curiosity, because there's probably some truth that I can't see when I'm coming to opinion on something that someone else has a very different opinion about. And it goes back to our earlier conversation about decision making. And I have had to learn the hard way that what I think is a good decision, I might not be operating with all the information. And it's really important to look at those complex issues in a full, rounded manner to then come to an opinion. And you still might agree to disagree, yet it's a more full conversation.
Thank you, panelists. Each one of you has really provided us with a landscape that is accessible. You brought home some very complex issues in a way that we could understand. Students, I bet you have a bunch of lines of inquiry to take on into your own research and understand this global issue and its relevance for our local trade-dependent region. You know, we might talk about various policies at multiple levels, but behind all of this, what's important are the rules of engagement and how do we build a structure to facilitate flow that is sustainable and ethical, and that's where we all have a part to play. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our beautiful audience, and my mother always told me, don't forget to thank the one who gave you that present, that birthday present, and you had to go and track that uncle in the corner and say thank you, and I've forgotten to do that for our sponsors. So Paul, if you could very awkwardly take us back to the first few slides, because I do have to thank our sponsors for this event. So,
And you know, Divya, I just want to thank you for this wonderful work that you're doing here, and excellent moderating.
oh, thank you. You were truly awesome to work with. So we want to thank our global sponsor, the Bamford Foundation, who has supported our students in so many incredible ways, and of course is our key sponsor for this event. Our community sponsors, True Blue and Labor Works. Our students are wearing these fabulous purple vests, and thanks to Labor Works sponsorship. And we've got Center for Global Studies. I'm affiliate faculty up there, and they said, hey, you guys are doing cool stuff. We want our name on your program, so put us down for whatever you need. And Eisenhower Carlson, thank you, Arthur, for coming through with the sponsorship and being such a fabulous host with us. So thanks, everyone, for coming. Have a great night.